The music stopped the moment Julian stepped through the tall doors of the ballroom, and every eye in the room turned toward him, like a wave pulling back before it crashes. He felt it instantly, the way the air changed, the way conversations dropped into whispers, the way fans lifted to cover mouths that were already curling into smiles that were not kind. He gripped his cane tighter and forced his shoulders back, though the movement sent a sharp pull of pain through the muscles that had never healed properly since the day the cannon fire tore through his left side. He had once walked into this same room with a confident stride, his boots striking the marble floor in a rhythm that matched the orchestra, his uniform pressed and gleaming, his face unmarked by anything but youth and certainty. That man had vanished somewhere on a battlefield far from home, replaced by someone the nobility now called the Broken Duke, a title he had heard whispered more than once when servants thought he was out of earshot. His mother, the Duchess Margaret, stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his good arm, her chin lifted with the kind of pride that dared anyone to say a cruel word within her hearing. She had insisted he come tonight. She said hiding away in the countryside would only feed the rumors that he was too weak, too broken, too finished to hold his title with dignity. She said the only way to silence the whispers was to stand in front of them and let them see that he was still a man worth respecting. Julian was not so certain she was right, but he had agreed, because refusing her felt like one more thing the war had taken from him, and he was tired of losing pieces of himself to a wound that had already cost him enough. The ballroom of Ashford Hall glittered with candlelight, bouncing off crystal chandeliers, and the air smelled of perfume and warm wax, and the faint sweetness of wine. Ladies in silk gowns moved across the floor in practiced steps, their laughter bright and easy, while gentlemen in tailored coats bowed and postured, each one trying to outshine the other in wit or charm. It was a world Julian had once belonged to without question. Tonight it felt like a stage where he had forgotten his lines. He made his way toward a quiet corner near a marble pillar, each step slower than he wanted it to be, his cane tapping against the floor, in a sound that seemed far too loud in the sudden hush. He caught sight of familiar faces, men he had once called friends, women who had once smiled at him with open admiration. Now their eyes slid away from him, as if looking too long might somehow mark them with the same misfortune that had marked him. Near the refreshment table, a cluster of young nobles gathered, their heads bent close together, in the manner of people who believed themselves clever and unseen. At the center of them stood Viscount Ashbourne, a tall man with a sharp jaw and an even sharper tongue, dressed in a coat so finely cut it seemed designed to remind everyone nearby exactly how much it had cost. Ashbourne had never fought in any war. He had spent the years of conflict attending parties and managing his family's fortune, yet he carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed bravery was something you could purchase along with a good tailor. Ashbourne caught sight of Julian crossing the room, and a slow smile spread across his face, the kind of smile that promised nothing good. He leaned toward his companions and said something Julian could not hear, but he did not need to hear the words to understand their meaning. A ripple of laughter passed through the group, quickly muffled behind gloved hands, though not quickly enough to hide it entirely. Julian kept his eyes forward. He had learned, in the months since his return, that meeting cruelty with silence was often the only dignity left available to him. He reached the pillar and lowered himself carefully onto a nearby bench, grateful for a moment to rest his leg, though he was careful to keep his expression composed, careful not to let anyone see how much even that small distance had cost him. The Duchess excused herself to speak with an old friend across the room, promising to return shortly, and Julian was left alone with his thoughts and the growing ache in his side. He watched the dancers move in elegant circles, their laughter light and untouched by anything heavier than the next song, and he felt, not for the first time, like a ghost standing at the edge of a life he used to live. It was Lord Gerald Finch, one of Ashbourne's closest companions, who approached first, his steps unsteady from too much wine, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry. He greeted Julian with an exaggerated bow, the kind that mocked rather than honored, and asked in a tone dripping with false concern whether the Duke found it difficult to dance these days, or whether he simply preferred to watch from the safety of his seat. Julian answered evenly that he was content to observe, his voice steady despite the heat rising in his chest. Finch smiled and turned to share a look with Ashbourne, who had drifted closer, drawn by the promise of entertainment. Ashbourne studied Julian for a long moment, taking in the cane resting against his knee, the slight stiffness in the way he held his left arm, the faint scar visible along his jaw where a blade had once come too close. Then, with the casual cruelty of a man who had never known real suffering, Ashbourne remarked that the war had certainly changed the Duke, and not, he added with a smirk, for the better. A few nearby guests overheard and laughed, though several others looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Julian felt the sting of it settle deep in his chest, sharper than any wound the battlefield had given him. He had faced cannon fire without flinching, had carried wounded men from burning fields while his own blood soaked through his uniform, and yet nothing had prepared him for the particular sting of being mocked by men who had never risked anything at all. He opened his mouth to respond, though he was not certain what words would come, when Ashbourne, encouraged by the laughter, decided to press further. He rose from where he stood and began to mimic Julian's walk, exaggerating the slight drag of his left foot, hunching his shoulders in a cruel imitation of the way Julian sometimes favored his wounded side when the pain grew too sharp to hide. The performance drew a fresh wave of laughter from the small crowd that had gathered, though it was quieter now, tinged with the discomfort of watching something that felt, even to the unkind, a little too far. Julian sat perfectly still, his jaw tight, his hands folded over the top of his cane. He had learned to master his expression during long nights in field hospitals, watching men scream through wounds far worse than his own, and he called on that same discipline now, refusing to give Ashbourne the satisfaction of seeing him react. It was in that moment, amid the laughter and the sting of humiliation, that Julian noticed a young woman standing near the edge of the room, close to the doorway that led toward the servants' passage. She was dressed simply, her dark hair pinned back neatly, a tray balanced carefully in her hands, clearly one of the household staff assigned to keep the guests supplied with refreshments throughout the evening. Unlike everyone else in the room, she was not laughing. She was not looking away either. She was watching Ashbourne's cruel performance with an expression Julian could not quite name, something between disbelief and quiet anger, her dark eyes steady and unflinching. For a brief moment, their gazes met across the crowded room, and Julian felt something shift inside him, something he could not explain. There was no pity in her eyes, no discomfort, no desire to look away from what she saw. There was only a kind of clear, honest recognition, as though she understood exactly what it cost him to sit there and endure this without breaking. It was the first time all evening that someone had looked at him and seen a man rather than a spectacle. The moment passed quickly. Ashbourne, growing bored with his own performance now that Julian refused to give him a reaction, straightened his coat and returned to his circle of friends, already searching for some other source of amusement. The music resumed, the dancers returned to the floor, and the small crowd that had gathered to watch drifted back into their own conversations, the cruelty already forgotten by everyone except the man who had endured it. Julian remained on the bench, his heart pounding harder than it had during the mockery itself, though not from anger this time. He searched the room for the young woman he had seen, but she had already slipped back through the servants' door, her tray still balanced carefully, her expression unreadable now that no one important was watching her. He did not know her name. He did not know anything about her beyond the brief moment their eyes had met across a room full of people who had forgotten how to see him. But something about the memory of her steady gaze stayed with him long after the ballroom's laughter had faded into the background noise of the evening, a small and unexpected comfort in a night that had otherwise offered him nothing but reminders of everything he had lost. The Duchess returned a short while later, her expression softening with concern when she saw the tightness still lingering around her son's eyes. She asked quietly if he wished to leave, and though every part of him wanted to say yes, Julian shook his head. He had come tonight to prove he could still stand among these people without breaking, and leaving now, after Ashbourne's cruel display, would only confirm every whisper that had followed him since his return. So he stayed, watching the dancers turn beneath the chandeliers, listening to music that no longer felt like it belonged to him, and thinking, more than once throughout the rest of the evening, of a quiet maid near the servants' door whose eyes had held no pity at all, only something that felt, strangely, like respect. By the time the ball ended and the guests began filing out into the cool night air, Julian had not spoken another word to Ashbourne or his companions, had not given them another moment of satisfaction. But as his carriage pulled away from Ashford Hall, rolling slowly down the long drive lined with torches, he found himself glancing back toward the house, wondering, without quite understanding why, whether the young woman with the steady eyes was still somewhere inside, moving quietly through rooms full of people who never noticed her at all. He leaned his head back against the carriage seat and closed his eyes, the ache in his side settling into a dull throb that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Tomorrow there would be more whispers, more careful glances, more reminders of everything the war had taken from him. But tonight, for reasons he could not quite explain, his thoughts kept returning to a single moment of quiet dignity in a room full of noise, and he found, for the first time in a long while, that he was not thinking only of his pain. Morning came to Deverell Manor, with a pale gray light that pressed against the tall windows of Julian's study, and he sat there long before breakfast, staring at letters he had no interest in answering. Sleep had come in fragments the night before, broken by the same memory that had followed him home from the ball, the sound of Ashbourne's exaggerated laughter, and the strange steadiness in the eyes of a maid he had never met. He told himself it meant nothing. A single glance across a crowded room was not the sort of thing a man of his position should dwell upon, especially not when there were far more pressing matters demanding his attention, matters of the estate, of tenant complaints about the harvest, of his mother's growing worry that he spent too many hours alone in this study, rather than among people who might still value his company. Yet no matter how firmly he tried to redirect his thoughts, they kept circling back to that brief moment near the servants' door. Meanwhile, below stairs in the kitchens of Ashford Hall, the morning after the ball brought its own kind of tension, though of a very different sort. The younger housemaids gathered near the great hearth, speaking in hushed and excited tones about everything they had witnessed the night before. The gowns, the music, the scandalous behavior of certain young lords who had drunk far too much wine. Among them stood Alara, quietly polishing silver at the long wooden table, listening without joining the conversation, her thoughts still lingering on the wounded man she had watched being mocked in front of an entire ballroom. She had seen cruelty before. Growing up in a household of modest means, she understood well enough how the world often treated those who could not defend themselves, how strength was praised while weakness, even weakness earned through sacrifice, was so often met with ridicule instead of respect. But there had been something particularly bitter about watching a man, who had clearly given so much of himself for his country, being reduced to a source of entertainment for people who had given nothing at all. Her brother, Peter, had gone to war 3 years earlier, full of the same confident pride Julian must once have carried, and he had never returned. The letter informing her family of his death had arrived on an ordinary afternoon, delivered by a boy on horseback, who could not meet her mother's eyes as he handed it over. Since that day, Alara had carried a quiet, simmering anger toward anyone who spoke lightly of soldiers, who treated the cost of war as though it were nothing more than an inconvenience to be mocked at parties. Mrs. Doyle, the head housekeeper, a stern but fair woman who had managed Ashford Hall's staff for over 20 years, noticed Alara's silence and asked if something troubled her. Alara hesitated before answering honestly that she had found the treatment of the Duke of Deverell the previous evening deeply unkind, and that she did not understand how people who called themselves noble could behave with so little compassion toward a man who had suffered for their sake. Mrs. Doyle's expression softened, though she kept her voice low, mindful of the other maids nearby. She agreed quietly that the young lords of the ton had grown careless with their cruelty, forgetting that titles did not excuse bad character. She warned Alara gently, however, that servants were not paid to have opinions about their betters, no matter how justified those opinions might be, and that it was safer, always, to keep such thoughts to oneself. Alara nodded, though something in her chest resisted the advice even as she accepted it. She returned to her polishing, her hands moving automatically over the silver, while her mind wandered back to the image of the Duke sitting perfectly still on that bench, refusing to give his tormentors the satisfaction of a reaction, his dignity somehow more powerful in its quiet endurance than any loud protest could have been. As the day continued, word arrived below stairs that Ashford Hall would host another gathering within the fortnight, a smaller affair, meant to celebrate the engagement of a distant cousin of the household, though everyone understood such occasions were as much about display and gossip as they were about genuine celebration. Preparations began at once, and the servants found themselves busy from morning until night, polishing floors, arranging flowers, and preparing for another evening of watching their betters perform for one another. Alara worked without complaint, as she always did, though she found herself wondering, more than once throughout the following days, whether the Duke of Deverell would attend this next event as well, and if he did, whether he would once again find himself subjected to the same cruelty that had marked his return to society. She did not have to wonder for long. 2 days before the engagement celebration, a message arrived from Deverell Manor requesting confirmation of attendance, along with a brief note from the Duchess Margaret expressing her hope that the evening would prove more pleasant than the last. The note was read aloud among the household staff by Mrs. Doyle, who could not entirely hide the sympathy in her voice as she spoke of the Duke's difficult return to society. That evening, as Alara helped prepare the linens for the upcoming celebration, she found herself in conversation with Nora, a fellow maid, closer to her own age, who had also witnessed the previous night's cruelty, and shared much of Alara's quiet disapproval. Nora confided that she had heard from one of the footmen that the Duke's injuries had been far worse than anyone realized, that he had nearly died on the battlefield before finally being brought home, and that his recovery had taken the better part of a year, filled with pain that few people ever saw because he was too proud to show it. Alara listened carefully, feeling something tighten in her chest at the thought of a man enduring such suffering only to come home and face ridicule instead of gratitude. She asked Nora, carefully, whether anyone below stairs knew much about the Duke's character, beyond his injuries, and Nora admitted that the servants who had worked at Deverell Manor before spoke well of him, describing a master who treated his staff with fairness and had never been known for cruelty or arrogance, even before the war. The information settled into Alara's thoughts like a small seed, growing quietly over the following days as preparations for the celebration continued. She found herself, without quite meaning to, paying closer attention whenever his name was mentioned, curious about a man whose dignity in the face of humiliation had struck her so deeply on a night when everyone else in that glittering ballroom had failed to see him as anything more than an object of amusement. Meanwhile, at Deverell Manor, Julian continued his slow recovery, spending mornings working through estate matters with his steward, Mr. Colton, and afternoons, attempting, with limited success, to regain some measure of the strength he had lost during his long convalescence. His valet, Simon, who had served him faithfully since before the war, encouraged him gently to attend the upcoming engagement celebration, arguing that avoiding society entirely would only strengthen the rumors that had begun circulating since his difficult appearance at Ashford Hall. Julian resisted at first, the memory of Ashbourne's mockery still fresh and painful, but eventually agreed, if only because his mother's disappointment at his reluctance weighed more heavily on him than his fear of further humiliation. He told himself he would attend, endure whatever cruelty awaited him, and return home having proven, at least to himself, that he could not be broken by the careless laughter of men who understood nothing of real sacrifice. As the day of the celebration approached, Julian found his thoughts returning, again and again, to the quiet maid, whose steady gaze had offered him the only genuine respect he had encountered all evening. He did not know her name, did not know if he would even see her again, yet the memory of that brief connection had become, unexpectedly, a source of quiet strength as he prepared to face society once more. On the afternoon before the celebration, Julian asked Simon, almost offhandedly, whether he knew anything about the household staff at Ashford Hall, explaining vaguely that he wished to send a note of thanks for their service during the previous event. Simon, though slightly puzzled by the unusual request, promised to make inquiries, unaware of how much weight his master had placed on the answer he hoped to receive. That evening, as Julian sat alone in his study once more, watching the last light of day fade beyond the windows, he allowed himself, for the first time since his return from war, to feel something other than grief and frustration settle over him. It was a small and fragile feeling, barely more than curiosity, yet it carried within it the first faint stirring of hope he had known in a very long time, hope that perhaps not everyone in the world had lost the ability to see him as more than his wounds. The candles at Ashford Hall burned brighter than ever on the night of the engagement celebration, and the guests arrived in a steady stream of carriages, their laughter spilling out into the cool evening air long before they reached the grand entrance. Alara moved quickly through the corridors below stairs, carrying trays of delicate pastries toward the main hall, her mind occupied with the endless list of tasks Mrs. Doyle had assigned for the evening. She had not expected to think of the Duke of Deverell again so soon, yet the moment she stepped into the ballroom carrying a fresh tray of refreshments, her eyes found him almost immediately, standing near one of the tall windows, dressed in dark blue that made his pale, tired face look even more striking against the vivid colors surrounding him. He stood with his cane resting lightly against his side, his posture careful but proud, and Alara felt a small, unexpected flicker of relief at simply seeing him upright and present, as though some part of her had worried he might not have found the courage to return. The celebration proceeded much as such gatherings always did, with music and dancing and endless conversation about matters that meant little beyond the walls of the grand house. Alara moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, refilling glasses and offering trays, careful to remain as invisible as her position required, though her attention kept drifting back toward the tall window where Julian stood, watching the festivities with an expression that seemed to hold both determination and quiet exhaustion. It happened quickly, the way such moments often do. A young footman, newly hired and clearly nervous under the weight of his first major event, moved too quickly through a crowded section of the room, his tray of crystal glasses tilting dangerously as he tried to avoid a group of laughing guests who had stepped unexpectedly into his path. In his effort to correct his balance, he stumbled directly toward where Julian stood, and though Julian tried to step aside, his weakened leg betrayed him, causing him to lose his footing entirely. For a heartbeat, it seemed certain he would fall, his cane sliding uselessly against the polished floor, his hand reaching for the window frame that remained just out of reach. Several nearby guests gasped, more from surprise than concern, and a few, Alara noticed with a flash of anger, seemed almost amused by the prospect of witnessing his humiliation firsthand. Alara did not think before she moved. She set down her tray on the nearest surface and crossed the distance between them in a few quick steps, reaching Julian just as he began to fall, bracing her shoulder beneath his arm, and steadying him with a strength that surprised even herself. For a long moment, they remained frozen together, his weight leaning heavily against her, his breath ragged with the effort of catching himself, while the surrounding guests watched in stunned silence, uncertain how to react to a servant touching a nobleman so directly. Julian regained his balance slowly, his face flushed with a mixture of pain and embarrassment, though when he turned to look at the person who had caught him, his expression shifted into something closer to astonishment, as he recognized the same steady dark eyes he had noticed across the ballroom at Ashford Hall 2 weeks earlier. Before either of them could speak, a familiar voice cut through the murmuring crowd, sharp with false concern and unmistakable amusement. Viscount Ashbourne had witnessed the entire incident from a short distance away, and he approached now with the easy confidence of a man who considered himself untouchable, his eyes moving between Julian and Alara with obvious calculation. He remarked, loudly enough for those nearby to hear, that it seemed the Duke required assistance from the household staff, simply to remain standing, wondering aloud whether Deverell Manor might consider hiring a permanent attendant to prevent such unfortunate scenes from repeating themselves. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter passed through the small crowd that had gathered, though several guests, Alara noticed, looked distinctly troubled by Ashbourne's cruelty rather than entertained by it. Alara felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from anger, and before she could stop herself, she straightened her shoulders and met Ashbourne's gaze directly, an act of boldness that servants rarely dared to attempt with a man of his standing. She said, in a voice that trembled slightly but did not waver, that any person present might have stumbled given the crowded conditions of the room, and that assisting a guest who required steadying was simply common decency, something she had clearly witnessed too little of that evening. A shocked silence followed her words, broken only by a few scattered gasps from nearby guests unaccustomed to hearing a servant speak so directly to a member of the nobility. Ashbourne's expression darkened, his easy smile faltering into something colder, though before he could respond, Mrs. Doyle appeared at Alara's side, her face pale with alarm, quickly ushering her away from the scene, with murmured apologies to the assembled guests. Julian, still recovering his composure, watched the exchange with an expression of quiet astonishment, unable to fully process what had just happened. In all the months since his return, no one, noble or otherwise, had spoken up in his defense with such immediate and fearless conviction. He wanted to say something, to thank her properly, But Alara had already been led away through the servant's door, leaving him standing alone once more beside the window, his heart pounding with something far more complicated than the pain in his leg. Ashbourne, recovering his composure quickly, laughed off the incident for the benefit of the remaining onlookers, dismissing Alara's boldness as the foolish outburst of an overreaching servant who would surely be corrected by her employer before the night was through. He turned his attention back to his companions, already searching for some other source of entertainment, apparently satisfied that the matter had been resolved in his favor. Julian, however, found himself unable to simply return to the evening as though nothing had happened. He excused himself from a conversation with an old acquaintance and made his way carefully toward the edge of the ballroom, his thoughts consumed entirely by the memory of the young woman who had risked her position, perhaps even her employment, to defend him against a man who held far more power over her future than she held over her own words. Below stairs, Mrs. Doyle spoke quietly but firmly with Alara, reminding her of the very real danger she had placed herself in by speaking so openly to a man like Viscount Ashbourne. Alara listened respectfully, understanding the truth in every word, yet found she could not bring herself to regret what she had said. She explained, when Mrs. Doyle pressed her for an explanation, that she had simply been unable to remain silent while watching a wounded man be mocked for the simple act of nearly falling, when the true fault lay entirely with a careless footman and an overcrowded room. Mrs. Doyle's expression softened slightly at this, though she still cautioned Alara to be more careful in the future, reminding her that servants who drew too much attention, even for admirable reasons, often found themselves without positions before they fully understood why. Alara promised to be more careful, though privately she wondered whether she truly meant it, given how right it had felt to finally speak the truth aloud, in a room full of people too comfortable with cruelty. The remainder of the evening passed without further incident, though word of the exchange spread quickly among the household staff, whispered from kitchen to hallway, with varying degrees of admiration and concern. Some of the older servants worried aloud that Alara had made a dangerous enemy in Ashbourne, a man known for holding grudges and using his considerable influence to make life difficult for those who crossed him. Others, particularly the younger maids who had grown weary of watching the nobility treat them as invisible, spoke of Alara's boldness with quiet pride, as though she had spoken for all of them in that single moment of defiance. Julian left the celebration earlier than planned, his mind too occupied to remain among the crowd any longer. As his carriage rolled away from Ashford Hall, he found himself replaying the moment again and again, the feeling of her steady grip beneath his arm, the fearless clarity in her voice as she confronted Ashbourne, the brief flash of her eyes meeting his own before she was led away. He realized, somewhere along the quiet road home, that he still did not know her name, and that this fact bothered him far more than it reasonably should have. That night, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, Julian finally asked Simon directly whether his earlier inquiries about the household staff at Ashford Hall had yielded any results. Simon admitted that he had learned very little beyond the fact that most of the staff were well regarded, though he promised to make further inquiries the following day, sensing, though not fully understanding, how important the answer had become to his master. Julian thanked him quietly and retired to his chambers, though sleep remained elusive for hours afterward. He lay awake staring at the darkened ceiling, thinking not of the pain in his leg or the cruelty of Ashbourne's words, but of a quiet maid, whose courage had shone brighter than anything he had witnessed since his return from war, a woman who had broken every rule of propriety to defend a stranger simply because it was the right thing to do. Simon returned to Deverell Manor 3 days later with the information his master had requested, though he presented it with a note of caution in his voice, uncertain why a duke would take such particular interest in a household maid. He explained that her name was Alara Whitfield, that she had served at Ashford Hall for nearly 2 years, and that she was known among the staff as diligent, quiet, and unusually direct for someone in her position. He added, almost as an afterthought, that her brother had died in the war, a fact that seemed to explain a great deal about the fearless way she had spoken to Viscount Ashbourne in front of an entire ballroom. Julian absorbed this information slowly, sitting at his desk with the morning light falling across scattered correspondence he had not yet found the will to answer. The knowledge that her brother had died in the same conflict that had left him wounded settled heavily in his chest, and he understood, with sudden clarity, why her eyes had held no pity when she looked at him that first night at Ashford Hall. She had not seen a broken nobleman deserving of either scorn or sympathy. She had seen, perhaps, a reflection of the brother she had lost, a man who had given something of himself for a cause larger than his own comfort. He found himself wanting to thank her properly, not with a hastily written note delivered by a servant, but in person, though he understood how difficult such a meeting would be to arrange without causing exactly the kind of scandal Mrs. Doyle had clearly feared on the night of the celebration. A duke did not simply visit a household maid without raising questions that neither of them could easily answer. Yet the more Julian considered the matter, the more he realized he could not simply let the moment pass without acknowledgement. He decided, after much deliberation, to write to Lord Ashford, the master of Ashford Hall, requesting a private audience regarding a matter of household staffing, a pretense thin enough that he worried it might be seen through immediately, though he hoped it would be sufficient to gain him entry to the estate without drawing undue attention. Lord Ashford, a good-natured, though somewhat oblivious man, who had always held Julian in high regard, agreed readily to the meeting, assuming it concerned some matter of estate business between neighboring households. Julian arrived at Ashford Hall on a quiet afternoon, several days after the celebration, dressed simply, and arriving without the usual fanfare that accompanied his more formal visits. After a brief and largely meaningless conversation with Lord Ashford regarding matters of little consequence, Julian excused himself under the guise of wishing to walk in the gardens before his journey home, a request Lord Ashford granted without hesitation, entirely unaware of the true purpose behind his guest's sudden interest in fresh air. The gardens of Ashford Hall stretched behind the main house, in careful rows of hedges and flowering shrubs, tended by staff who moved quietly among the greenery, and it was there, near a stone bench beneath an old oak tree, that Julian found Ilara kneeling beside a bed of late roses, her sleeves rolled up as she carefully removed weeds from among the flowers, entirely unaware of his approach. She looked up at the sound of his cane against the gravel path, her expression shifting quickly from surprise to careful composure as she recognized him, rising immediately and offering a proper curtsy, despite the dirt still clinging to her hands. Julian raised a hand gently, asking her not to trouble herself with formality, explaining that he had come specifically to find her, though he was uncertain, even as he said the words, exactly how to continue. Ilara waited quietly, her dark eyes watching him with the same steady attention he remembered from that first night, neither flattered nor intimidated by his sudden appearance in the gardens where she worked. Julian found himself grateful for her patience, as he struggled to find words adequate to the moment, eventually settling on a simple and sincere expression of gratitude for what she had done at the celebration, acknowledging that few people in his life had ever spoken up for him with such fearless conviction. Ilara listened to his words carefully, and when she finally responded, her voice carried none of the careful deference servants typically offered to their betters. She told him plainly that she had not spoken up out of any particular loyalty to him personally, but because she could not bear to watch cruelty go unanswered, especially cruelty aimed at a man who had clearly sacrificed far more than his tormentors could ever understand. Her honesty struck him more deeply than flattery ever could have, and Julian found himself asking, almost without meaning to, whether she would be willing to speak with him further, if only for a short while, before he returned home. Ilara hesitated, glancing briefly toward the main house where Mrs. Doyle might notice her absence, before agreeing quietly, gesturing toward the stone bench beneath the oak tree. They sat together for nearly half an hour, their conversation moving slowly, from careful formality, into something more genuine as the minutes passed. Julian learned of her brother Peter, of the quiet grief that still lived in her family's modest home, of her decision to seek work at Ashford Hall following her brother's death, partly out of necessity, and partly, she admitted, because staying in her family's house surrounded by his absence had become unbearable. In turn, Julian found himself speaking more openly than he had with anyone since his return from war, describing, in careful and measured words, the battlefield that had taken his health and nearly his life, the long months of recovery that had followed, and the particular loneliness of returning home to a society that seemed to value only the appearance of strength rather than the reality of survival. Ilara listened without interrupting, her expression neither pitying nor dismissive, simply attentive in a way that made Julian feel, for the first time in longer than he could remember, genuinely seen rather than merely observed. When he finished speaking, she offered no easy reassurances, no false comfort about how everything would surely improve with time. Instead, she said simply that survival itself was a kind of victory that too few people understood or respected, and that the opinions of men like Viscount Ashbourne said far more about their own emptiness than about any weakness in the men they mocked. Her words settled into him like something solid and true, and Julian found himself, for a brief and unguarded moment, smiling in a way he had not managed since long before the war had changed everything. Alara noticed the change in his expression and offered a small smile of her own, the first he had seen from her, and something in that simple exchange felt more valuable to him than any grand gesture society could have offered. Their conversation ended reluctantly, interrupted by the distant sound of a bell calling the household staff back to their duties. Alara rose quickly, smoothing her apron and offering a brief but genuine farewell before hurrying back toward the main house, leaving Julian alone once more beneath the old oak tree, though this time his solitude felt considerably lighter than it had in months. As his carriage carried him back toward Deverell Manor that evening, Julian found himself turning their conversation over in his mind again and again, marveling at how effortlessly she had spoken to him, without the careful performance of deference that colored nearly every interaction he had endured since his return. She had treated him not as a wounded duke to be pitied or mocked, but simply as a man, flawed and struggling, worthy of honest conversation rather than careful management. He understood, even as the manor came into view through the carriage window, that he could not simply let this single meeting be the end of things. Something had shifted within him during that quiet hour in the garden, something he could not yet name but felt determined to pursue further, regardless of how difficult or unconventional such a pursuit might prove to be, given the vast difference in their circumstances. That night, as he prepared for sleep, Julian found himself thinking not of Ashbourne's cruelty or the aching wound in his side, but of dark, steady eyes and an honesty that had asked nothing of him except to be exactly who he was, wounds and all. For the first time since returning from war, he fell asleep without the familiar weight of despair pressing against his chest, replaced instead by something that felt, tentatively and cautiously, like hope. Over the following weeks, Julian found reasons, both plausible and increasingly transparent, to visit Ashford Hall more often than his previous friendship with Lord Ashford had ever required. He arrived with small pretexts, a matter of shared boundary lines between their estates, a question about tenant arrangements, a book he claimed to have borrowed and needed to return, each excuse thinner than the last, though Lord Ashford remained pleasantly oblivious to the true purpose behind his neighbor's frequent visits. Alara, for her part, began to watch for the sound of his carriage on the gravel drive, a fact that both pleased and unsettled her in equal measure. She understood well enough the impossibility of what was growing between them, understood that a duke and a household maid existed in worlds so distant from one another that even the most generous imagination could not easily bridge the gap. Yet each time she saw him walking carefully toward the gardens, his cane tapping against the stone path, something in her chest lifted in a way she could not fully explain or suppress. Their meetings remained brief and carefully arranged, always in the gardens where her work gave her legitimate reason to be present, always kept short enough to avoid drawing suspicion from Mrs. Doyle or the other staff. Yet within those stolen moments, a genuine friendship began to take root, built not on the careful performances of courtship that governed the relationships of the nobility, but on honest conversation between two people who had each lost something essential to the war, and found, unexpectedly, that the other understood the particular shape of that loss better than anyone else in their lives. Alara told him, during one quiet afternoon beneath the old oak tree, about the years before Peter left for war, when their small family had gathered each evening around a modest table, her brother filling their home with laughter and impossible plans for a future none of them could have predicted would end so abruptly. She spoke of the letter that arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, of her mother's hands shaking so badly she could not open it, of reading the words herself because someone in the family needed to be strong enough to bear them first. Julian listened with the same quiet attention she had shown him, understanding intimately the particular ache of losing men in war, having watched too many soldiers under his own command fall in fields that seemed, in memory, endless and indistinguishable from one another. He told her, in return, of the friends he had lost, of the guilt that sometimes crept into quiet moments, The unanswerable question of why he had survived when so many better men had not. In these exchanges, neither of them offered easy comfort or false reassurance. Instead, they offered something rarer and more valuable, simply the willingness to sit with difficult truths without flinching away from them, a kind of companionship that asked nothing except honesty in return. Their growing closeness did not escape entirely unnoticed. Nora, the young maid who had become something of a friend to Alara during her time at Ashford Hall, began to observe the pattern of the Duke's visits and the way Alara's mood seemed to lift noticeably on the days he came. She said nothing at first, though her knowing glances grew increasingly difficult for Alara to ignore, until finally, during a quiet evening while folding linens together, Nora asked directly whether something was developing between her friend and the Duke of Deverell. Alara considered denying it, though she found she could not bring herself to lie to someone who had shown her nothing but kindness since her arrival at Ashford Hall. She admitted, quietly and with evident uncertainty, that she did not fully understand what was happening between them, only that their conversations had become important to her in a way she had not expected, and was not entirely prepared for. Nora listened without judgment, though she cautioned her friend gently, reminding her of the very real dangers such an attachment might invite, not only to Alara's position, but to her reputation and future prospects. Servants who became entangled with the nobility rarely found their situations improved by the experience, she warned, regardless of how genuine the feelings involved might be. Alara acknowledged the truth in her friend's words, though she found herself unable to fully heed the warning, drawn, despite every reasonable objection, toward a connection that felt more honest than anything she had known before. Meanwhile, at Deverell Manor, Julian's mother had begun to notice a change in her son as well, though she attributed it initially to the slow and natural process of healing from his long ordeal. She remarked, one evening over dinner, that he seemed more himself lately, more inclined to smile, more willing to engage with the world beyond his study, and she expressed quiet gratitude for whatever had brought about the improvement, unaware of the true source behind her son's gradual transformation. Julian considered, more than once, confiding in his mother about his growing feelings for Alara, though he hesitated each time, uncertain how she might react to such an unconventional attachment. He knew his mother to be a woman of genuine kindness, far more compassionate than most of her social circle, yet even she had been raised within the rigid expectations of their world, expectations that made no allowance for a duke's affection toward a household servant. Instead, he continued his careful visits, treasuring each stolen conversation in the gardens of Ashford Hall, allowing himself, for the first time since his return from war, to imagine a future that included genuine happiness, rather than simply the quiet endurance of duty and pain. He found himself, during these weeks, gradually regaining strength he had not felt since before his injury, motivated by something more powerful than mere obligation, a reason to face each day that extended beyond simply surviving it. Yet even as their bond deepened, both Julian and Alara understood, without needing to speak the words aloud, that their situation could not remain hidden indefinitely. Ashford Hall was not so large a household that servants and guests alike failed to notice patterns of behavior repeated over several weeks, and it was only a matter of time before someone less discreet than Nora took notice of the Duke's frequent visits and began to ask questions neither of them was prepared to answer honestly. The first sign of trouble arrived on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, when one of the footmen, a young man named Peter Ellery, who bore no relation to Alara's late brother despite the shared name, mentioned casually to a fellow servant that the Duke of Deverell seemed remarkably devoted to matters of estate boundary lines, given how frequently his visits coincided with young Alara Whitfield's afternoon duties in the garden. The comment, offered without particular malice, nonetheless found its way through the household's informal network of gossip with surprising speed, eventually reaching ears far less sympathetic than those of Alara's immediate friends. Word traveled, as such things inevitably do, beyond the walls of Ashford Hall itself, carried through the casual conversations of coachmen and messengers who moved between the great houses of the surrounding countryside, until eventually, though neither Julian nor Alara yet knew it, the whispers reached Viscount Ashbourne himself, a man who had never forgotten the humiliation of being publicly challenged by a household maid, and who recognized immediately the considerable value such information might hold for a man determined to see both the Duke and his defender properly humbled. Viscount Ashbourne received the news of Julian's frequent visits to Ashford Hall with the particular delight of a man who had been waiting patiently for an opportunity to restore his wounded pride. He had not forgotten the humiliation of being challenged so directly by a household maid in front of witnesses, an insult that had followed him quietly through several social circles, despite his attempts to laugh the matter away. The idea that the Duke of Deverell might be pursuing some manner of secret attachment to the very same maid struck him as almost too fortunate to be believed, a discovery that promised to deliver satisfaction on two fronts at once. He spent several days quietly gathering further details, questioning acquaintances who maintained connections among the household staff of the surrounding estates, careful not to reveal the true purpose behind his sudden interest in such seemingly trivial gossip. What he learned only confirmed his suspicions, painting a picture of regular visits, extended conversations in the gardens, and a pattern of behavior far too consistent to be explained away by mere coincidence or genuine estate business. Ashbourne understood immediately the power such information held. A duke entangled with a household servant represented precisely the kind of scandal that could dominate conversation throughout the entire season, and he intended to ensure that when the story finally broke, it would break in a manner most damaging to both parties involved, and most advantageous to his own restored reputation. He chose his moment carefully, waiting until an evening gathering hosted by Lady Pemberton, one of the most influential hostesses among the ton, an event certain to draw a substantial crowd of the very people whose opinions mattered most in matters of social standing. Julian had been invited, as had many of the households connected to Ashford Hall, and Ashbourne understood that such a public setting would provide the ideal stage for the revelation he had been carefully preparing. The evening began much as any other society gathering, with music and conversation flowing easily through Lady Pemberton's elegant drawing rooms, the guests moving between refreshments and idle gossip with the practiced ease of people who had attended 100 such evenings before. Julian arrived somewhat later than most, still finding large social gatherings physically taxing despite the gradual improvement in his strength, and took his place near a quiet corner, where he could observe the proceedings without unnecessary strain. Ashbourne waited until the evening had progressed sufficiently, until wine had loosened tongues and curiosity had reached its peak, before making his move. He approached a small group of prominent guests, including several notorious gossips whose words traveled through society with remarkable speed, and began, with practiced casualness, to remark upon the surprising devotion the Duke of Deverell had shown toward matters of estate business at Ashford Hall in recent weeks. He phrased his comments carefully, never stating anything so direct as an accusation, instead allowing implication and suggestive pauses to do the work of revelation. He wondered aloud, with false innocence, why a man of the Duke's standing would require such frequent visits regarding simple boundary disputes, and whether perhaps some other matter entirely explained his neighbor's remarkable attention to Ashford Hall's affairs. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, the name of a certain household maid, the same young woman who had so memorably challenged him at a previous celebration, allowing his listeners to draw their own conclusions from the connection. The effect was immediate and exactly as Ashbourne had intended. Whispers began circulating through the drawing room with astonishing speed, each retelling adding embellishments that moved further from truth and closer to scandal. By the time the story reached Julian's own ears, delivered by a well-meaning but clearly troubled acquaintance who felt he ought to know what was being said, the tale had already transformed into something far more salacious than the simple truth of genuine friendship and honest conversation. Julian felt the color drain from his face as he understood the implications of what was spreading through the room, understood immediately that Ashbourne had somehow learned of his visits to Ashford Hall, and had chosen this moment, this crowded gathering of society's most influential voices, to expose them in the most damaging manner possible. His first thought was not for his own reputation, already battered enough by months of ridicule that further gossip could do little additional harm, but for Alara, whose position and safety depended entirely on maintaining a respectability that Ashbourne's implications threatened to destroy completely. He searched the room for Ashbourne, finding him engaged in animated conversation with a cluster of guests who leaned in eagerly to catch each new detail of the unfolding scandal. Julian crossed the room with a determination that ignored the protest of his aching leg, arriving just as Ashbourne was delivering another carefully phrased insinuation about the nature of the Duke's interest in a certain household servant. The conversation stopped abruptly as Julian approached, the assembled guests, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of his sudden presence, aware that they had been caught discussing the very man now standing directly before them. Ashbourne, to his credit, did not flinch, meeting Julian's gaze with the same confident smirk he had worn on every previous occasion of their unpleasant encounters. Julian spoke quietly, but with unmistakable steel in his voice, asking Ashbourne directly what exactly he believed himself to know, and what purpose he imagined he served by spreading rumors about a household servant who had done nothing more than show basic human decency toward a wounded man. Ashbourne, unwilling to back down in front of an audience that had gathered to witness the confrontation, replied with false innocence that he merely found it curious how frequently the Duke's estate business seemed to require the personal attention of a particular young maid, and that surely such curiosity was only natural given the circumstances. The exchange drew the attention of nearly everyone remaining in the drawing room, conversations pausing, as guests turned to observe the confrontation unfolding between the two men. Julian understood, in that moment, that whatever he said next would shape not only his own reputation, but the entire trajectory of consequences that would follow for Elara, consequences she had no power to control and had done nothing to deserve. He chose his words carefully, aware of the weight they carried. He stated plainly that Miss Whitfield had shown him nothing but honest kindness and genuine courage, qualities apparently in short supply among certain members of society who preferred cruelty disguised as wit. He added, his voice growing steadier as he spoke, that if visiting a friend whose character he respected constituted scandal in the eyes of the ton, then perhaps the fault lay not with him or with Miss Whitfield, but with a society that had forgotten how to value genuine goodness over empty titles and inherited privilege. His words landed with unexpected force among the assembled guests, several of whom exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for the Duke to defend the maid so openly and directly, rather than deny the connection entirely, as propriety might have suggested. Ashbourne's smirk faltered slightly, though he quickly recovered, remarking with forced lightness that the Duke's passionate defense only confirmed exactly the sort of attachment he had suspected all along. Julian did not dignify the remark with further response, turning instead and making his way toward the door, his cane striking the floor with each determined step, leaving behind a room full of whispers that had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, from mockery toward something closer to grudging respect for a man who had refused to hide from an uncomfortable truth. Yet even as he departed Lady Pemberton's drawing room with what dignity remained available to him, Julian understood that the confrontation had done nothing to contain the scandal, and that word of what had transpired would reach Ashford Hall long before he could arrive there himself, to offer Elara whatever protection remained within his power to provide. News of the confrontation at Lady Pemberton's gathering reached Ashford Hall before the sun had fully risen the next morning, carried by a coachman who had overheard the entire exchange while waiting outside with the other drivers, and repeated it in vivid detail to the household staff, eager for any fresh gossip. By the time Elara arrived below stairs for her morning duties, the story had already spread through every corner of the servants' quarters, transformed through repetition into something considerably more scandalous than the actual events had been. Mrs. Doyle summoned Elara to her small private office shortly after breakfast, her expression grave, in a way that made Elara's stomach tighten with dread before a single word had been spoken. The housekeeper closed the door carefully behind them, ensuring their conversation would not be overheard, before explaining, with obvious reluctance, everything she had heard regarding the events of the previous evening. Elara listened in growing horror as Mrs. Doyle described how Viscount Ashbourne had publicly implied an improper relationship between herself and the Duke of Deverell, how the Duke had defended her honor directly in front of numerous witnesses rather than simply denying the connection, and how the resulting scandal was already spreading through society with the speed that only truly delicious gossip could achieve. She understood immediately the impossible position this created, not only for herself but for the entire household, whose reputation depended on maintaining a certain propriety among its staff. Mrs. Doyle's voice softened somewhat as she continued, acknowledging that she did not believe Elara had done anything genuinely improper, having observed her character closely enough over the past 2 years to trust in her fundamental decency. However, she explained, with obvious pain at having to deliver such news, that Lord Ashford had already received several inquiries from concerned acquaintances regarding the matter, and that maintaining Alara's position at Ashford Hall in the face of such widespread scandal might prove impossible, regardless of the actual truth behind the rumors. Alara felt the floor seem to shift beneath her, understanding immediately what dismissal would mean for her family's already precarious circumstances. Her mother depended partly on the modest wages she sent home each month, wages that had become even more essential since her brother's death had removed another source of income from their household. The prospect of losing her position, through no genuine fault of her own beyond the simple crime of accepting kindness from a man who happened to hold a title far above her station, struck her as bitterly unfair, though she understood well enough that fairness had never been a currency particularly valued by the society that governed her circumstances. She asked Mrs. Doyle, her voice steadier than she felt, whether there was anything she might do to address the situation, any explanation that might satisfy Lord Ashford's concerns, without requiring her dismissal. Mrs. Doyle hesitated, before admitting honestly that the decision now rested largely in Lord Ashford's hands, and that his response would likely depend heavily on how the scandal continued to develop over the following days. The conversation left Alara shaken in a way she had not anticipated, and she moved through her remaining duties that morning with a distracted heaviness she could not entirely conceal, despite her best efforts to maintain her usual composure. Nora found her during a brief pause between tasks, her expression sympathetic, though clearly troubled by the news that had already reached her own ears. Nora asked gently whether Alara regretted her friendship with the Duke, given the trouble it now threatened to bring, and Alara considered the question carefully, before answering with complete honesty. She admitted that she did not regret the conversations they had shared, the genuine understanding that had grown between two people who each carried the particular grief of losing someone to war, but that she deeply regretted the way society had twisted something honest into something shameful, punishing kindness as though it were a crime deserving of ruin. Meanwhile, at Deverell Manor, Julian spent the morning in a state of restless agitation, unable to focus on any of his usual duties, as he waited anxiously for news of how the scandal had affected Alara's position at Ashford Hall. He had considered, throughout the long carriage ride home the previous night, every possible way he might have handled the confrontation differently, though he could not honestly say he regretted defending her honor so directly, even knowing the attention it had drawn to their friendship. His mother, the Duchess Margaret, approached him during breakfast with an expression that suggested she too had heard some version of the previous evening's events, though her information appeared somewhat incomplete. She asked carefully whether there was any truth to the rumors reaching her regarding his involvement with a household maid at Ashford Hall, her tone neither accusing nor entirely disapproving, simply seeking clarity about a situation she clearly found confusing. Julian considered, for a long moment, how much to reveal to his mother, before deciding finally that honesty offered the only path forward that felt true to his own character. He explained, carefully and without exaggeration, the genuine friendship that had developed between himself and Alara Whitfield, describing her courage in defending him against Ashbourne's cruelty, and the honest conversations they had since shared regarding their shared experience of loss and grief following the war. The Duchess listened without interruption, her expression difficult to read throughout his explanation, and when he finished speaking, she remained quiet for several long moments before finally responding. She acknowledged, with evident reluctance, the very real difficulties such an attachment would create, given the rigid expectations of their society, difficulties that extended far beyond mere gossip into questions of inheritance, family expectations, and the fundamental structures that governed noble families like their own. Yet she also admitted, more gently than Julian had expected, that she had noticed genuine improvement in her son's spirits over recent weeks, an improvement she now understood had likely been connected to this unexpected friendship. She did not offer her full blessing, not yet, but neither did she forbid him from continuing whatever connection had developed, instead, advising him to consider carefully the full weight of consequences that would follow any decision to pursue the matter further in the face of society's disapproval. Julian thanked his mother for her honesty, understanding that her careful, measured response represented more genuine support than he had any right to expect given the circumstances. He spent the remainder of the day attempting to determine how best to help Alara, understanding that whatever consequences she now faced had resulted directly from his own actions in defending her so publicly. and feeling a growing determination that he could not simply allow her to bear those consequences alone, while he remained protected by the very privilege that had created the imbalance between them in the first place. 3 days after the scandal first broke through Lady Pemberton's drawing room, Lord Ashford summoned Alara to his private study, a rare occurrence for a household maid that immediately signaled the seriousness of what awaited her. She walked the long corridor toward his study, with her hands clasped tightly together, trying to steady the nervous trembling that threatened to betray her outward composure, rehearsing silently the honest explanation she intended to offer, regardless of how little it might ultimately matter to the final decision. Lord Ashford received her with an expression of genuine discomfort, a man clearly unaccustomed to handling matters of this delicate nature, more comfortable discussing crop yields and hunting parties than the complicated territory of scandal and reputation. He explained, somewhat awkwardly, that he had received several letters over the past days from acquaintances, expressing concern regarding the rumors connecting her to the Duke of Deverell, and that as much as he personally held no particular objection to her character or conduct, he could not entirely ignore the pressure such widespread gossip placed upon his household's standing within society. Alara listened quietly, understanding the direction of the conversation even before Lord Ashford finished speaking. She asked, when he paused, whether he intended to dismiss her from her position, and he confirmed, with obvious reluctance, that he saw little alternative given the circumstances, though he offered to provide a fair reference, acknowledging her genuine competence and good character throughout her time at Ashford Hall, regardless of the scandal that now surrounded her. She thanked him for his consideration, maintaining her composure through sheer force of will, though the weight of what this meant for her family settled heavily against her chest as she made her way back toward the servants' quarters to begin gathering her few belongings. Nora found her there a short while later, her expression falling immediately as she understood what had happened, without needing to ask directly. Nora embraced her friend tightly, offering what comfort she could, though both women understood that words alone could do little to address the genuine hardship this dismissal would bring. Alara explained, her voice steadier than her heart felt, that she intended to write to her mother that same evening, though she had not yet decided how to explain the loss of income that would inevitably follow, nor where she might find alternative employment given the scandal now attached to her name throughout the surrounding households. Word of Alara's dismissal reached Deverell Manor that same evening, delivered by Simon, who had maintained careful contact with certain members of the Ashford Hall staff throughout the unfolding situation, understanding well enough his master's deep investment in whatever news might arrive. Julian received the information with a mixture of anger and guilt that left him pacing his study long into the night, understanding fully now the true cost his defense of her honor had ultimately inflicted upon the very person he had intended to protect. He could not simply allow this injustice to stand unaddressed, not when the fault for her dismissal traced directly back to his own actions, his own inability to simply enjoy her friendship quietly, without drawing the attention of men like Ashbourne, who thrived on the misfortune of others. He spent the following morning in intense conversation with his mother, explaining the full extent of what had occurred, and asking directly for her counsel regarding what course of action might genuinely help Alara without causing her further harm through additional scandal. The Duchess listened carefully, her expression thoughtful throughout his explanation, and when he finished speaking, she surprised him by suggesting a course of action considerably bolder than he had anticipated from a woman so deeply embedded in the careful protocols of noble society. She proposed that rather than continuing to hide the connection or attempting quiet gestures of support that would likely only fuel further gossip, Julian should instead address the matter directly and publicly, demonstrating through clear and unmistakable action that his regard for Alara Whitfield was genuine and honorable, rather than the scandalous entanglement society had assumed. Julian considered his mother's suggestion carefully, understanding both the risk and the potential it carried. A public declaration would either silence the rumors entirely, by demonstrating the honesty of his intentions, or it would confirm every worst assumption society had already formed, potentially damaging both his own remaining reputation and whatever chance Alara might have of rebuilding her life following her dismissal. Yet the alternative, allowing her to suffer the consequences of scandal while he remained silent and protected, felt entirely unacceptable given everything she had shown him about courage and honesty since that first night at Ashford Hall. He decided, after much careful thought, that he would attend the upcoming harvest gathering, a significant social event hosted annually by one of the region's most prominent families, drawing together nearly every important household within the county. It would provide precisely the kind of public setting necessary to address the scandal directly and unmistakably, before an audience large enough to ensure his words would spread through society with the same speed that Ashbourne's original insinuations had traveled. Before proceeding with his plan, however, Julian understood he needed to speak with Alara herself, both to inform her of his intentions and to ensure she genuinely wished for him to proceed, understanding that any decision affecting her future required her full consent rather than simply his own determination to correct an injustice he felt responsible for creating. He traveled to the small cottage where Alara's family lived, a modest but well-kept home on the edge of a nearby village, arriving unannounced on a quiet afternoon that found Alara sitting near the window, mending a torn garment, while her mother prepared a simple evening meal in the kitchen beyond. Alara's surprise at seeing him standing at her family's humble doorway was evident, though she invited him inside with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout every previous encounter, introducing him carefully to her mother, who regarded the Duke with a mixture of nervousness and cautious curiosity. Julian explained, once they found a moment of privacy in the small garden behind the cottage, everything he had discussed with his mother and the plan he had formed to address the scandal publicly at the upcoming harvest gathering. Alara listened with growing astonishment, understanding the magnitude of what he was proposing. A public declaration that would forever alter both their circumstances, regardless of how society ultimately received it. She asked him carefully whether he understood fully what such a declaration might mean, not only for his own reputation, but for the entire structure of expectations that governed his position as a duke. Expectations that had never before accommodated genuine affection towards someone of her humble station. Julian met her question with quiet certainty, explaining that he had spent months since his return from war, feeling as though society valued him only for the title he carried, rather than the man he actually was, and that in her company, for the first time since his injury, he had felt genuinely seen and valued as himself. He told her plainly that he could not simply return to a life of careful propriety and empty performance, not when he had glimpsed, through their friendship, the possibility of something considerably more honest and meaningful. Alara felt tears rising unexpectedly at his words, though she fought to maintain her composure, understanding the weight of what he was offering her, a chance at a future she had never dared imagine, given the vast difference in their circumstances. She admitted, quietly and with evident vulnerability, that her own feelings for him had grown far beyond simple friendship over recent weeks, though she had not allowed herself to fully acknowledge the depth of those feelings, given the impossibility their situation seemed to represent. Their conversation concluded with a fragile but genuine agreement to proceed with Julian's plan, both of them understanding that whatever happened at the harvest gathering would irreversibly shape the course of their futures, for better or for considerably worse, depending entirely on how society chose to receive a duke's public declaration of genuine regard for a household maid he had come to value more than any title or expectation society had ever placed upon him. The harvest gathering arrived on a crisp autumn evening. The grand hall of Ravensworth Manor, decorated with garlands of golden leaves and late-season flowers, the air filled with the warm scent of roasted meats and spiced wine that marked the season's most celebrated social event. Carriages arrived in a steady procession throughout the early evening, delivering nearly every prominent family within the county to an occasion that promised, as it always did, to provide weeks of conversation regarding who had attended, who had worn what, and whose behavior had proven most memorable. Julian arrived later than most, having spent the earlier part of the day steadying his resolve for what he intended to accomplish that evening, understanding fully that the words he planned to speak would either restore some measure of honor to Alara's damaged reputation, or destroy whatever remained of his own standing within society entirely. His mother accompanied him, her presence offering quiet support, though she remained understandably nervous about how the evening might unfold, given the boldness of her son's intentions. The whispers began the moment Julian entered the grand hall, quieter than they might have been months earlier, when his physical appearance alone had drawn cruel attention, though no less pointed in their focus. Nearly everyone present had by now heard some version of the scandal connecting him to a household maid, and curious eyes followed his progress across the room, waiting to see how the Duke of Deverell would conduct himself, given the considerable weight of gossip surrounding his name. Viscount Ashbourne, unsurprisingly, had also secured an invitation to the evening's festivities, and he watched Julian's arrival with the satisfied expression of a man who believed himself entirely responsible for orchestrating his rival's continued humiliation. He made his way toward a small gathering of acquaintances near the center of the room, positioning himself where he could observe whatever unfolded with maximum visibility, clearly anticipating further opportunities to mock the Duke's unconventional attachment throughout the evening. Julian moved through the initial hours of the gathering with careful patience, engaging in polite conversation, enduring the occasional pointed remark or knowing glance, waiting for the appropriate moment to execute the plan he had so carefully considered. He understood that timing mattered considerably, that his declaration required an audience substantial enough to ensure his words would spread widely, yet not so early in the evening that the impact might fade before the gathering's conclusion. The moment arrived as the orchestra paused between dances, a natural lull in the evening's festivities, when conversation tended to fill the temporary silence, drawing the attention of nearly everyone present toward whatever notable exchange might be occurring within the room. Julian recognized the opportunity immediately and made his way toward the small raised platform, where the host traditionally offered brief remarks throughout the evening, a location that would ensure his words carried clearly across the entire hall. He requested, with quiet but unmistakable authority, a brief moment to address the assembled guests, a request unusual enough that Lord Ravensworth, though clearly puzzled, granted it without hesitation, perhaps sensing that refusing would only generate more curiosity than allowing the Duke his moment to speak. The room gradually quieted as Julian took his place upon the platform, his cane steady beneath his hand, his expression calm, despite the considerable nervousness he felt beneath his composed exterior. He began by acknowledging directly the rumors that had circulated throughout society over recent weeks, rumors connecting his name to a household maid formerly employed at Ashford Hall, rumors that had already cost that same young woman her position and threatened to damage her reputation irreparably, despite her having done nothing beyond showing genuine kindness and remarkable courage toward a man society had otherwise chosen to mock and dismiss. A murmur passed through the assembled crowd at his direct acknowledgement of the scandal, several guests exchanging glances of surprise at hearing the matter addressed so openly, rather than quietly denied or ignored as propriety typically demanded. Julian continued, his voice growing steadier as he spoke, explaining that the rumors, though whispered with cruel intent, had actually understated, rather than exaggerated, the truth of the matter. He described, without embellishment but with evident sincerity, the night he had first encountered Elara Whitfield at Ashford Hall, mocked and humiliated by men who had never risked anything of genuine value, and how she alone among the assembled guests had looked upon him not with pity or scorn, but with honest respect. He spoke of her courage in defending him publicly against Viscount Ashbourne's cruelty, an act that had cost her dearly, despite requiring nothing more of her than simple human decency. Julian's gaze found Ashbourne within the crowd as he spoke these words, and though he did not name the Viscount directly, the pointed nature of his reference left little doubt regarding whom he addressed. Ashbourne's expression darkened considerably, though he remained silent, apparently unwilling to interrupt a duke's public address, regardless of how uncomfortable the words had become for his own reputation. Continuing, Julian described the friendship that had developed between himself and Elara over subsequent weeks. Honest conversations built not upon the careful performances that governed most relationships within their society, but upon genuine shared understanding between two people who had each sacrificed something essential to the war that continued to shape both their lives. He acknowledged openly that this friendship had grown, over time, into something considerably deeper, a genuine affection he no longer wished to hide or deny, regardless of the expectations society placed upon a man of his position. The room had fallen entirely silent by this point, every guest present captivated by the unprecedented spectacle of a duke publicly declaring his regard for a household servant before the assembled nobility of the entire county. Julian's mother watched from near the edge of the platform, her expression a complex mixture of pride and anxiety, understanding fully the magnitude of what her son had chosen to risk. Julian concluded his address by stating plainly that true nobility, in his estimation, had nothing whatsoever to do with inherited titles or fortunate birth, and everything to do with character, demonstrated through action, particularly action taken when no personal advantage stood to be gained. He declared that Alara Whitfield possessed more genuine nobility of character than nearly anyone he had encountered since his return from war, himself included, and that he considered himself fortunate beyond measure to have earned her friendship and, he hoped, her continued regard. As his words settled over the silent room, Julian stepped down from the platform, uncertain how the assembled guests would ultimately respond to what he had just revealed, understanding that the coming moments would determine whether his gamble had restored honor to Alara's reputation, or simply confirmed society's worst assumptions regarding their connection. The orchestra remained paused, the guests remained frozen in their varied reactions of shock, admiration, and disapproval, and somewhere within that uncertain silence, Julian understood that the fate of everything he hoped to build with Alara Whitfield now rested entirely in the hands of a society he had just openly challenged to reconsider everything it believed about worth and dignity. The silence that followed Julian's declaration stretched long enough that he began to wonder whether he had miscalculated entirely, whether his gamble would end not in vindication, but in complete social ruin for them both. He stood near the edge of the platform, his heart pounding harder than it had during any moment on the battlefield, watching the assembled guests exchange glances that seemed to weigh his words against everything they had ever believed about the natural order separating nobility from those who served them. It was Lord Ravensworth himself who broke the silence first, stepping forward with an expression of genuine admiration, rather than the disapproval Julian had feared most. He remarked, in a voice that carried easily across the quiet hall, that he had known many men who wore their titles as though courage itself, but had rarely witnessed a duke display the kind of genuine bravery Julian had just shown in speaking such difficult truths, before an audience fully capable of destroying his reputation for the offense. His words seemed to break something loose within the crowd, and slowly, tentatively, a few scattered voices began to murmur their own agreement, several older guests nodding thoughtfully, as though reconsidering assumptions they had held for far too long without genuine examination. Not everyone present responded favorably, certainly, and Julian noticed several faces still set in expressions of clear disapproval, unwilling or unable to reconsider the rigid boundaries that had governed their entire understanding of society. Viscount Ashbourne, sensing the shifting mood of the room, turning against him rather than toward the humiliation he had so carefully engineered, attempted one final effort to salvage the situation in his favor. He stepped forward, his voice carrying the same false confidence he had employed throughout every previous encounter, suggesting loudly that regardless of pretty speeches about character and nobility, the fundamental impropriety of a duke pursuing attachment to a household servant remained an insult to everything their society represented. Before Julian could respond, however, an unexpected voice answered from near the back of the hall, and the entire room turned to see Alara herself standing at the entrance, having arrived quietly during Julian's address, escorted discreetly by his mother's own carriage as part of a plan the Duchess had helped arrange, without her son's full knowledge. Understanding that Alara deserved the opportunity to speak for herself rather than remain merely the subject of others' declarations. Alara walked forward through the parting crowd with the same quiet dignity she had shown from the very first night Julian had encountered her, her simple but neatly kept dress a stark contrast to the elaborate gowns surrounding her, though she carried herself with a composure that made the difference in fabric seem entirely irrelevant. She addressed Ashbourne directly, her voice steady, despite the considerable weight of every eye in the room now resting upon her. She stated plainly that she had never sought attachment to a duke, had never imagined nor desired the complications such a connection would inevitably bring, but that she could not regret showing basic human kindness toward a man who had sacrificed considerably more for their country than anyone currently present in that hall. She asked Ashbourne directly what exactly he had sacrificed, what wounds he carried, what genuine hardship he had endured that gave him the authority to judge the worth of those who had given everything, while he had given nothing, beyond careless words designed to entertain a crowd too comfortable to examine their own emptiness. The question landed with devastating precision, and Ashbourne found himself, for perhaps the first time in his privileged existence, entirely without a clever response. Several guests who had previously laughed at his cruel jokes now regarded him with expressions of clear discomfort, understanding, perhaps for the first time, exactly how hollow his mockery had always been. Lord Ravensworth, apparently satisfied that the matter had reached its natural conclusion, called for the orchestra to resume, though the atmosphere throughout the remainder of the evening carried a different quality than before, conversations turning increasingly toward genuine admiration for the courage both Julian and Alara had displayed, rather than continued scandal regarding the impropriety of their connection. Julian made his way toward Alara through the dispersing crowd, taking her hand gently despite the many eyes still watching their every movement, and asked quietly whether she had meant what she said, whether she genuinely wished to continue whatever connection had grown between them, despite everything society had already put her through, and might yet continue to demand of her. Alara met his gaze with the same steady honesty that had first drawn his attention across a crowded ballroom months earlier, and she answered that she had never been more certain of anything in her life, that whatever difficulties their connection might still face, she would rather face them honestly, beside a man who valued her true character, than spend her life pretending to be someone smaller and safer, simply to satisfy expectations that had never once considered her genuine worth. Julian, moved beyond words by her answer, knelt carefully, despite the protest of his injured leg, drawing a small ring from his coat pocket that he had carried with him throughout the evening, uncertain, until this very moment, whether circumstances would allow him the opportunity to offer it. He asked her, before the remaining guests who had gathered to witness this unprecedented conclusion to the evening's drama, whether she would consent to become his wife, not as an act of rebellion against society, but as the natural culmination of a genuine partnership built upon honesty, respect, and shared understanding that neither of them had expected to find within the rigid boundaries of their world. Alara's answer came without hesitation, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall as she accepted, tears finally slipping free from eyes that had remained steady through months of hardship and scandal. The assembled guests, even those who had entered the evening prepared to disapprove entirely, found themselves swept into a moment too genuine and too moving to resist, breaking into applause that filled Ravensworth Manor with a warmth entirely different from the cruel laughter that had once greeted Julian at another ball months earlier. In the weeks that followed, society continued to discuss the unconventional match between the Duke of Deverell and his household maid, though the conversation gradually shifted from scandal toward something closer to admiration, as more families reconsidered the rigid assumptions that had governed their judgments for so long. Viscount Ashbourne found himself increasingly excluded from gatherings where his particular brand of cruelty was no longer welcomed, his influence diminishing steadily as more of society recognized the emptiness behind his carefully cultivated charm. Julian and Alara married the following spring in a quiet ceremony, attended by those who genuinely cared for their happiness, rather than merely their social standing, including Alara's mother, who wept with joy at witnessing her daughter's transformation from grieving servant into a woman finally recognized for the remarkable character she had always possessed. Nora attended as well, having been offered a position at Deverell Manor as Alara's own trusted companion, grateful to see her friend's courage finally rewarded rather than punished. In the years that followed, Julian continued his slow but steady recovery, finding in his marriage a source of strength that no physician's remedy had ever managed to provide, while Alara brought to Deverell Manor a quiet wisdom that transformed the household staff's relationship with their employers into something built on genuine mutual respect rather than mere obligation. Together, they raised their children to understand that true worth had nothing to do with titles or inheritance, and everything to do with the courage to see others clearly, to defend what was right even when it proved costly, and to choose honesty over comfortable silence whenever circumstances demanded it. The story of the wounded Duke and the quiet maid who had broken every rule to defend him became, over time, a tale told throughout the county not as scandal, but as inspiration, a reminder that the truest nobility often revealed itself not in grand titles or glittering ballrooms, but in the simple, steady courage of a single person, willing to see beyond appearances to the genuine worth of another human being, regardless of what society demanded they should see instead.